Okay, so today we're going to talk about sacrum diagnosis. And to start it off, we're going to talk a little bit about a C deflection test. So for a C deflection test, we're going to be contacting the PSISs bilaterally with our thumbs. So I'm going to find those landmarks using the iliac crest and following posteriorly until I find those little ridges that are the PSISs, and I'm going to hook underneath. Once I've hooked underneath, I'm going to ask my patient to bend forward. So go ahead and bend forward slowly from the top of your head down. I'm going to be watching the PSISs and looking to see if there's any asymmetry that develops during flexion. And what I see is this right side, the right PSIS moves anteriorly and superiorly. Come back up. We're going to repeat that, confirm that. Go ahead and bend forward. And definitely confirmed, moving superiorly. So we're going to say that the C deflection test is positive on the right. So a positive C deflection test, or the fact that the PSIS is moving superiorly, suggests an increased restriction on that side of the sacroiliac joint. Why would that be? When the spine moves into flexion and the sacrum moves into flexion, if both sacroiliac joints are free of restriction, you would expect symmetric PSIS movement, because the sacrum will be able to move freely between the ilia. If you have restriction on one side, and in this case on the right side, when I make my contact on the PSISs, which are on the ilia, and then I have her bend forward, go ahead. The reason that this right PSIS moves superiorly and anteriorly is because the restriction in the sacroiliac joint on the right side causes the ilia to move sooner with the sacrum during flexion. Another important feature or piece of information that can be obtained by the C deflection test is a consideration of the side of the axis when you talk about torsion dysfunctions. And if there is a torsion, a C deflection test on the right would imply that there would be likely to be a oblique axis on the left side, left-sided oblique axis. So continuing the somatic dysfunction diagnosis of the sacrum, we now, in a prone position, want to evaluate our landmarks. So our key landmarks that we're going to be using to diagnose are going to be our iliac crest, in order to find our pelvis, obviously, our PSISs, in order to orient us to where the sacrum is. From there, we can move medially to the sacral sulci, kind of roll medially to the sacral sulci. And you might find that the sacral sulci might be a little bit superior, a little bit inferior. Just try to find where that balance point is. And then you can also follow down the sacroiliac joints to the ILAs, or the inferior lateral angles of the sacrum. And then you hook underneath to get a good viewpoint. Other landmarks include the coccyx medially. So if you were to go down the midline of the sacrum, you'd find the coccyx. And if you were to follow the sacrum superiorly, you would find the spinous process of L5. And then lateral to that, you would find your transverse processes of L5. Now, what are we going to do with those landmarks? We're going to be looking at the static position of our sacral sulci and our inferior lateral angles, or ILAs. So first, we're going to find our PSISs. Here they are. We're going to roll medially into the sacral sulci. You're going to try to get your dominant eye over those sacral sulci. And what I see is that this right sacral sulcus is deep as compared to the left, which means it's more anterior. And when I come down the sacroiliac joint to the ILAs and I hook underneath, I find that the left ILA is more posterior. Come back up, find my sacral base and then my L5 spinous process, move laterally to transverse processes, and I see that L5 transverse process on the right is more posterior and on the left is more anterior, suggesting a right rotation. And then to test that motion in extension, I'm going to have my patient come up on their elbows. And I see with extension, it becomes, actually doesn't change at all. And then I'm going to have you come up into child's pose so that we can induce a little bit of flexion. Good. I keep my thumbs on L5 as best I can, reorient myself, and yes, I am still there. And I find that my L5 diagnosis still does not change. So go ahead and lie flat. So that suggests that my L5 is a neutral type dysfunction or type 1 dysfunction with a rotation right and a side bending to the left with a preference neither in flexion nor in extension. So now that we're done with our static landmarks, we're going to move on to a little bit of dynamic testing and start with a spring test. So again, finding our PSISs, coming medially, we'll find our sacral base. And what we want to do is make contact with one hand at the sacral base, right at the junction of L5 and S1, and then put our other hand right on top. And what we're going to be doing is kind of supporting our elbows, straightening them out, and inducing a little bit of anterior motion on the sacral base. And what we're expecting is a normal spring. So what we're inducing is a little bit of extension in the lumbar spine, but flexion at the sacral base. If our sacral base has a freedom of motion anteriorly, we would expect there to be normal motion. And in our patient, we do find normal motion. If our sacral base was positioned posteriorly in our somatic dysfunction, by pushing anteriorly on the sacral base, we would be inducing flexion, which would be the opposite of its dysfunction. So we would find more restriction, and that we would call that a positive test. So no motion equals a positive spring test, and good motion or normal spring is a negative spring test. Hopefully that's not confusing. The next test we're going to be doing is a Sphinx test. And for a Sphinx test, you actually have an option. Different texts talk about different landmarks as being used for your Sphinx test. One landmark you can use is your ILAs, and that's one of the more common ones that are used. So you can come onto the ILAs, hook underneath. You're visualizing for the asymmetry, and we had mentioned that the left ILA is posterior, the right one is anterior. And then we're going to have our patient come up on their elbows, which would induce lumbar extension but sacral flexion. And what we see is our ILA landmarks become more symmetric. So as the sacrum or the sacral base flexes or moves anteriorly, our asymmetry neutralizes, which suggests and reinforces the idea that we have a sacral base that is anterior, right? It has an anterior motion preference. Alternatively, go ahead and lie flat. Alternatively, we can use our sacral sulci as our landmarks, and same principle applies. So we start with our PSISs, find our sacral sulci. So we're observing our asymmetry, and we said that our right sacral sulcus is anterior or deep, and our left sacral sulcus is posterior or shallow. And we're going to have our patient come up on their elbows. And when they come up on their elbows, we find that there is a better symmetry in the sacral sulci, and then flatten out. And that reinforces, again, the idea that with sacral flexion, which is what we're inducing when we have our patient come up onto their elbows, that the asymmetries improve, which suggests an anterior type sacral dysfunction. So now let's break down our somatic dysfunction diagnosis of the sacrum. on exam, we had a positive C deflection test on the right. We had a right sacral sulcus that was deep, a left ILA that was posterior, and an L5 that was rotated to the right. The way we would look at that now is, because our deep sacral sulcus and our posterior ILA are on opposite sides, that tells us that we are going to have an oblique axis in our somatic dysfunction. Because our C deflection test was positive on the right, that suggests that we would have a left oblique axis, which would mean that our right sacral sulcus that is deep represents an anterior sacral base on that right-hand side. Because we had a spring test and a sphinx test that was negative, that supports our diagnosis of an anterior sacral base on one side, or an anterior sacral dysfunction preference. So taking our sacrum, if we were to rotate it anteriorly on an oblique axis in a way to match our landmarks, we would move our right sacral sulcus anterior to make it deep, our left ILA posterior to make it posterior, and that would suggest a left rotation of the sacrum on a left oblique axis. Now we need to take that information along with L5 and determine whether we have a rotation or a torsion. So we determined that we had a left sacral rotation on a left axis, but because our L5 is rotated to the right, that's creating a torsion type force between L5 and S1. That would suggest that we then have a left on left sacral torsion.